everyone. It's nice and a little bit strange to be speaking in person to people and seeing people's faces in person instead of seeing all those little Zoom squares. I'm Ashley Brewer. My job is mostly about helping technology, infrastructure, and professional services companies who are trying to go vertical, help them figure out how to do that better. Spend a lot of my time working on industry-specific campaigns for sales enablement and marketing, and have learned some things about what makes that possible and what kind of holds that back, and I'm planning to talk through that today. So I know you all signed up for this session, but I'm not sure, like, are you all interested in industry? Like, are you already doing this? Is it on the radar, or do you just need to fill a slot before lunch?
No, we're already doing it.
Okay.
But any ideas on how to optimize
Yeah,
better?
that's great.
We have 4 key verticals that we focused on today, and we're expanding into 4 new ones.
Oh, that's exciting and a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you?
We have like 3 verticals and then different.
Yeah.
So
We're looking to build our marketing strategy on a new newly formed, and we're structuring our international marketing strategy for each operation and by region. So we're here to learn.
Oh, exciting. Great. Well, I'm so glad to hear it. I get really excited about vertical marketing. I have seen a lot of companies like go through this transformation and really target vertical, especially companies that had a lot of horizontal strategies and products. So I'm always excited to hear about companies who are either already down that process or expanding it, because I feel like it is really one of the most customer-centric ways to go to market. I think a lot of times we find that even horizontal products need to be messaged differently or even implemented differently in different markets. So I think I get really excited about vertical marketing and about the way it helps us put fire at the forefront. But there are a lot of roadblocks we run into with companies who have tried to go vertical or in the process of going vertical. The first is knowing which verticals to prioritize, and especially how many to prioritize. Kimberly, I know you were just saying you're expanding your verticals. A lot of times that strategy of getting the right amount, knowing which verticals get a heavy emphasis, which need more of a light touch, it just can be a challenge. And it's something that if you get wrong, you can find that you're trying to serve too many verticals all at once. You're doing it in a thin way, and you're basically at a horizontal approach again, which can be a challenge. If you do too few, you may find that your total addressable market is too small to serve your goals, and vertical marketing is taking up a much smaller portion of the pie than you wish it was. So that is a challenge. Certainly one we run into, and particularly in today's job market, is it can be really hard to get the expertise you need in-house in that specific vertical and to be credible there. Sometimes you have someone who has maybe they sold into that market for a really long time or been tangential to that market, but they don't really know it. They haven't lived in that market, and it can be a challenge to be credible or to build that credibility without either the in-house talent or an easier way to build those relationships. One we have been addressing a lot, especially with companies who are going through a transformation of going vertical, is sales team challenges. Sales teams who are used to selling horizontal products, or maybe used to and really good at selling to one target persona, sometimes struggle to translate to industry, especially if they're trying to go up the chain as well and speak to those pain points. And a lot of times companies don't do that good of a job of helping equip their sales teams to go into industry. Maybe they give them like an industry primer 101. Maybe there's a webinar, but you know, it's a big leap for a salesperson to go in with industry talking points and be credible. And that takes a lot of investment in sales enablement for them to be effective and do it. If you don't, sometimes they'll default back to their horizontal talking points, or they'll kind of half do it. And then, you know, at the finish line of carrying on your vertical strategy, it's fallen apart. So sales enablement is a place that that vertical really has to be done well. And then a problem that I'm sure none of you have ever faced is a lack of bandwidth to really to do this right. Certainly, I think I will never tell you anything new about customization and segmentation. We all know it should be done. We all know that in an ideal world, we have a complete kit of materials For every industry, we're targeting full funnels of content, lots to activate, hot topics. It's not knowing that it needs to be done that is the gap for most of our clients, for most marketing teams. It's actually having the bandwidth to do it, the expertise to do it, and being able to get it over the finish line. So these are the challenges we've been seeing our clients run into as they do this. Any of them feel familiar? I saw some heads nod. Andy, still familiar? Anybody in particular have a comment on anything you run into? There were big challenges. I think, some of them not surprising. I think the one that to me feels like the biggest pain point is this purple one, because I've seen a lot of marketing teams do really good work to get vertical ready and have really embraced, a company strategy to go vertical. They get the meetings, they the demand is there, and then it falls apart at the finish line, and that's the worst case scenario. So, these are things that are big barriers, and I think worth going through and worth pushing through and solving for, but not easy to do it. So really, we see if you're going vertical, if you're going to be targeting this way, there are 5 key things you need, 5 key steps on that roadmap. And each of them has things that if you do it right can help supplement for and help you prepare to get over all of those barriers. None of that surprise you. It really starts with the right go-to-market strategy. Market intel, we'll talk about what I mean by that, but this is a place where I feel like vertical sometimes falls apart. Is we go from knowing which vertical to target to preparing to go into that vertical, and we miss gathering the insights, miss making sure we really know that market. Messaging, big advocate for really thoughtful processes about taking your industry, taking your story and preparing the messaging. Collateral, how do we create all of those materials we need to back up that strategy? And then what does a rollout look like? So we'll talk about each of these a little bit today.
So, the one thing that I'm just thinking about as I look at this, actually going back to our previous slide, the purple, how is that reflected in here? Because I do agree with you, it's the sales organization that I think is critical. And where do you fit those in here as one of the key strategies? Yeah,
so it's a great point. They're in here the entire way. So we'll talk about this, what you read these words and you may think about this as customer, but intel is also intel for the sales team. Messaging is also messaging for the sales team. Collateral is those sales kits. And rollout, we actually, when we get to that slide, we have a whole thing on how do you even roll this out to sales and what does that look like? We have a sales enablement bent to our work. So when we think about anything going industry, we would never recommend you just do it with a marketing only approach. It has to have a sales enablement lens, and each of these checkpoints should have a sales enablement view into it. Do you own marketing and sales enablement, or just one or the other?
More marketing, partner with sales.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing I found. Sometimes marketing teams are like really ready to do that, and then they work with a sales enablement team who's treating it like a webinar, basically. Like, okay, you guys get everything ready, and then we'll do the training webinar. And I think the challenge here is most marketing teams don't want to just like absorb sales enablement, right? They want sales enablement to do that, and there's good reason for that. But sales enablement teams at a lot of companies have mostly been built to do webinars, to do trainings, and that's it. And the marketing skill set that's here is what's really required. So depending on the organization's politics, culture, and the marketing team's willingness, I think that's a challenge we have to solve for. You can't do all this and then hand it off to sales enablement to do a webinar and think that's going to work. It has to be an integrated process, and whether that means marketing takes it or marketing partners with sales enablement up levels, that's dependent on the organization. I've seen both happen, but it's not successful if it's just marketing.
It's interesting because we have another factor which comes into it, which I believe is the program people. So I think we struggle because they're the best sales people, right? But they're not sales people, they're also operational.
Yeah.
So the issue is how do you get them to actually empower the sales people as well?
And not just be a crutch.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's a big one as well. And so it depends a little bit on the company, right? Because I think, and the culture of sales. So where I see this, that particular challenge being the worst is when sales doesn't really believe that the company is committed to the vertical strategy. Because salespeople will often do, they can see where the wind is blowing and they can get on board and they want to do what's going to help them get their comp and do that. But if the company has had like a lot of changes of direction and they think, oh, well, now it's vertical, and now I'm supposed to know all about healthcare, I'm supposed to know all about the public sector, but this guy already does, so I'll just bring him into my calls, let him do that. Like, if you don't have a culture where the sales team believes that the change is going to stick, how could you possibly expect them to invest the time to build that expertise? So it really starts at the very top with the focus and with belief in the focus and the change management of that when you have that particular problem. Okay, great questions. Okay, so the go-to-market planning. These are the questions we feel normally need to be answered, and we talked a lot about this last one around alignment. First is knowing which verticals are the best targets. A lot of companies already do this really strategically, but you'd probably be surprised how often this is like more trend response, or like, oh, we got this one big account in this industry, so let's have a vertical strategy for it. Certainly recommend like a really refined approach to evaluating different markets, prioritizing them and tiering them, so that you know how far you're going, where you're going to go with it. Because when this is more ad hoc, the prioritization and selection of verticals, that leads to that disbelief of sales, it leads to changing direction. Our recommendation is to prioritize growth drivers and to know a small number of markets, and on equal footing, know if you're also at the same time running horizontal expansions or launching a new service line, that you can prioritize all of those things and then align your marketing team to do it, because otherwise the resourcing of this just gets really sketchy. So then in go-to-market planning, really assessing how your current offerings meet their needs. We'll dig into this in a second, but you can't always just take your current offerings and bring them to market in the vertical. There's going to be some level of customization and deciding what you're going to do, how you're going to do that. If you have to bring something entirely new to market is a big challenge. So really during the planning, having that assessment period of how your current offerings meet the needs will help you have a better view into what it would actually take to activate that vertical. I've seen companies get really excited about like a total addressable market number, and independent of this yellow block, independent of that alignment, the number and the work to get there is just out of sync. So how far will we take this strategy? It's a good question to ask, right? Because you see a company like Salesforce who has built, I mean, how many of you all are using Salesforce? Right. And there's a lot of people use Salesforce, right? But then you also have the financial services cloud and the manufacturing cloud. Like, there are players out there who have not just said, okay, we're going to verticalize our existing products or our capabilities, but we're going to bring entirely new products to market. And so when a company says we're going to embrace a vertical strategy, one of the core questions is, to what extent, how far, what's the real vision here? How far are you taking this? And knowing that, just like having a landing page on your website with that industry is a different level of commitment and a different level of payoff. We talk a lot about this one, but how are we going to align sales and marketing to tackle this strategy? Anytime sales is not at the table for this, or it's being treated as a webinar, it's a massive red flag, because verticalizing at a marketing only level without the product support, the operational support, the sales support, it's just really unlikely to pay off. I can just imagine you have all of this campaign to target a specific vertical, and then the person who actually walks in the door isn't equipped to talk about it that way. The disconnect, the dissonance there, and then, these industries are getting hit all the time with companies who have previously been horizontal and are trying to verticalize. Their BS detector is really sensitive. And if you get hit with that, if they don't believe you're real, you're serious, and can credibly deliver, You may not get a second at that. So you need to be prepared. That part has to be done correctly, or it is just not worth anyone's time. Okay. So we talked about the different levels of approach, and here's how we like to think about it. So the first is positioning only. And this is when you've assessed that your current products do meet their needs, but the way you talk about it needs to change. You have to position it differently, respond different to pain points, and be prepared to tell that story to that market. That is it's often a lighter lift. It's still a lot of work on the marketing, but in terms of bringing something to market, you need less product support, you need less operational support. It's more about just getting the story right, getting the marketing campaign correct, and making sure sales can be aligned and consistent with that marketing story. Positioning and capabilities. That's where you say, we're taking most of our core offerings, but there's some capabilities they need to have. A good example of this is in the public sector. A lot of times we work with technology companies who need to add certain security features to work with the public sector. Maybe they need certain certifications to work with the public sector. There might be some light features added to a product. It's a lighter lift, but there's some work that needs to be done on it to be credible. And that's something that can be really valuable to do. It's definitely a bigger lift than only doing positioning, requires a lot more resources and investment from the company, but it's feasible. And then this third level, which is where we see a lot of the tech companies we work with going, is actually creating new products to bring to market, with like the example of the financial services cloud. And doing this, it kind of seems like the ideal case scenario because you've got something new to bring to market. But what it requires is a lot of commitment from the company to do everything right: the product, the sales support, the operations. So this is a place where if you have to do it, it's even worse than just doing one or two, but has a huge payoff if you do it well. Go ahead.
How often do you find that companies think they're in level 1, but in actuality, it requires level 2 or level 3?
All the time. And sometimes there's a roadmap for that, right? Sometimes a company says, year 1, we're going to do position only because we need to prime the market. We need them to respect us and know who we are. And then we're going to add some capabilities to our core product offerings in year 2 as we build out this product and do the fact finding for year 3. And sometimes we find companies have tiered their verticals to say, in these 3 markets, we're going to just do positioning only, but in this market, we're building a product. So it's a matrix strategy. I think it's just about knowing where you're in and having some alignment of what the resources it takes to do that are. Because if you're being asked to do, bring a new product to market, that's an entirely different lift than to create a set of materials with talking points for a specific industry. So having that conversation and letting your leadership know, or as you set a budget, know what the investment required to perform at these levels is important. And the investment needs to be aligned against that potential, because if they think they're going to do level 3 with just a standard marketing budget, it's usually not viable. Okay, any questions on the go-to-market strategy part of it, or comments, experiences? Okay. So market intel, we talked a little bit at the top. This is a step that is often missed, and I think part of it is because people see it as like a never-ending expensive research project, and it can be, and sometimes that's crucial depending on what you're going after. But sometimes it's just basic. Sometimes it's just making sure there are foundation, especially if you're at that level 1 positioning only. Sometimes it's just making sure you have credible answers to some basic questions, and that nobody is just kind of throwing that out here based on reading like a Deloitte white paper. So the first question is, what is in the strategic plans of these industries? What are they prioritizing? What are they focusing on? What challenges they are facing, how they solve those challenges today, and if you fill a gap. And if you can't answer a question that you fill a gap, it's unlikely that you're going to be successful to the extent that those TAM numbers sometimes suggest. And then so the industry intel, I think, is pretty obvious. Most people know that if you're targeting an industry, you need to research that industry. I find that sometimes this part breaks down a little bit, and people forget that their competitive set resets in different vertical markets, and that new competitors show up higher differently in different vertical markets. So if you have a competitive Intel team or competitive Intel structure, I always say that anytime you're doing a new vertical, really put the pressure on to reassess the competitive landscape by vertical, by industry. Because it probably looks different. There's probably some niche player who you run into nowhere else that is entrenched in this industry, is considered credible, who maybe your stuff is not their core competency, but they kind of can do it, or they say they can kind of do it. And you need to understand who those people are. Understanding how entrenched they are. Is this someone you're going to have to be prepared with a battle card to talk against? Is this somebody who could be a potential partner? Understanding that landscape is critical. And then, you know, what do they do that frustrates the buyers? Where are their gaps? All that standard competitive intel stuff taken with an industry or vertical lens. And what are they working on next? Do they have an insurmountable advantage worth knowing? So lots of ways to get this intel, and I'm sure you're used to that. There's certainly the online and the database research that you all can probably do in-house or with core teams. We always recommend really doing the qualitative, the interviews, the research studies with the target industry to get the verbatims, not just relying on the knowledge inside your four walls to assess what you think the pain points are. It's definitely cheaper to just ask the sales guys who've sold into that industry, the sales team who's sold into that industry, what they're hearing, what they are. But the truth is they're just not the experts. The people who live in those industries are the experts. So talking to them is crucial. And then, you know, a thing that when it's viable is a great idea is some strategic hires. If you're really targeting an industry, making a key hire from that industry who understands it, already has relationships, is sometimes the most affordable path to getting these insights, or a consulting project and engagement with somebody who has either come out of that industry or really knows that industry. So then that takes us to messaging, which is where, like I said, I feel like it's kind of the fun part for marketers. I think when you know your company so well, being able to understand a new industry and think about how your story looks different, I see that as a really fun thing to do, a really exciting thing to do. And this is where that marketing skill set comes in and is so valuable. But I think we have to be realistic that a lot of B2B messaging is already really bad. A lot of B2B messaging is already super self-centered. I don't know how many presentations I've seen that start with core values, company timeline, executive leadership team, map of locations. And so you've got all of the, and then they get right into a bunch of technical jargon about the company. So with B2B messaging, you guys are laughing because you've never experienced this. You've never seen a bad B2B messaging presentation. So because B2B messaging is already kind of bad, a lot of times the vertical is not always bad. Some people's messages are great, but not all. And so when you're in this situation and you then try to verticalize it, it just is so much worse. And if you start with saying, we're such and such and we serve healthcare, like you just add that to it, it's not going to work. You really have to have your message center on why they should buy. What is the unique problem this industry is facing? What are they dealing with? And not just the table stakes stuff like 5G is going to change telecom, so you need us. Like, don't tell them what they already know, but show them that you understand what they're living in and help them see how you fit in, or help them understand how you fit in. You want to be specific about the product or service you're queuing up, and be specific about the problems that will solve, and help them walk through the journey of understanding you're credible, believing you understand them, and seeing that you could solve a problem for them. And a lot of this is marketing table stakes, but for a lot of it's table stakes, but so why is it so hard to actually execute? Why doesn't it always come through? And a lot of that is bandwidth. A lot of that is a lack of intel. A lot of that is being spread too thin. But when you go industry, if the message is wrong, it's going to fall apart. And if it's wrong on the marketing side, it's gonna be way harder for sales to carry it through. Because if we can't get our collateral to tell a really compelling story, there's no way sales can just kind of talk around it when they actually get at the table. So the messaging has to be nailed, and it's worth delaying things. It's worth taking the time to get the messaging right. And if you don't feel you can do the messaging right, it is better not to do it at all. Thoughts or questions about this part?
It's funny, maybe I'm being negative and.
Yeah.
Thank God none of my colleagues are here. But I think sometimes the struggle is actually internal, because my colleagues and my operational colleagues are in love with what they do. And so this is like preaching to the choir. We all know this.
Yeah,
So
right?
that's sometimes my bigger struggle is how to convince my internal colleagues that this is what's needed.
Yes. Oh my goodness. And I think as marketers, sometimes for good, it's hard not to just write to get approved, right? You know, you're going to have to send this to the head of product, and you know that they're in love with this one feature, and that if it doesn't show up in the story, you're going to get 3 emails about why the multi-tenant architecture isn't in the story. And so they're
Well,
like,
that's the problem there, right? Is because it's just like how people like to talk about themselves.
Yes.
Companies like to talk about their products, and it's always about us first, and whatever.
mhm.
And you really need to try and get them to get into a client first mindset, and doing that is like Sisyphus. It's just so hard.
Oh, I know. It is. And
That's why
I
that persona piece is so important. Like, you've gotta like put your hat on to like understand who you're talking to and what their problems are. You've gotta like be able to relate to them. And that, if you can't do that, then you've already like shot yourself in the foot before you even open the door.
Well, and that's what I'm trying with the B2B, with the consumer. I can go out and get research, so I can show them, but it's like finding research to be able to prove that these are the message points, or these are the pain points that they really care about is
yeah.
sometimes.
Well, it takes a lot of research to get to that, right? I mean, I find that it takes a tremendous amount of work to understand the vertical, what their pain points are, and then how my product is going to make a difference to address that. And not only do I have to know where they've been, but I also need to know the challenges that are coming for them. Because if I can't have my sales team address that, what's the point?
Well, then I'll add to that, because then you have to also add in the, how am I gonna speak to them in their language? Because you haven't figured
Oh
that
my
out, then-
gosh. And then in their own language, not only do you have a problem with product being comfortable with letting you speak in their own language, brand sometimes doesn't want to let us speak in their own language.
Yeah.
So many times, you know, you have like, well, our brand voice is this, right? But you know that you can't say it. You have to use the language of the industry and reflect that back. So that's why I think focus helps with this. If you're trying to serve 8 verticals, being able to have time and energy to do it right, and let's face it, fight all of the politics that are going to come with doing it right, is really challenging. So you really have to have like a focus and have the company be really on board. Sometimes when we're facing what you faced, we'll suggest A/B testing, and say, okay, great. We'll say it like I want to say it. We'll say it like you want to say it. And we'll run, you know, linked ad campaign at this buyer persona in this industry, and we'll just see what works. And more times than not, you get at least a data point that they'll be frustrated and grumble about, but then maybe you get another data point and you start to support it. There are ways to explore and to try to flip the difference, but a lot of it comes with building the organizational capacity to be customer centric, which marketing can't fully own and lead, but you can be an advocate for. You can help beat the drum. You can refuse to compromise even when it's easier to compromise, and try to support it. Because once you do that, once you come out there with the messaging that's too product specific, or brand has a really abstract voice, and now you're product specific and abstract, and you're not resonating, but you have a good picture of a hospital on the front of the slide deck, it's gonna fall apart. And at the end of the day, you know who's gonna wear it when it falls apart? Marketing. I'm glad to hear no one has any challenges with messaging. You, okay. So then, the fun part, I think, the much easier part in the scheme of it is actually the collateral. Now, scaling it, getting enough resources to do it is a challenge, but I think if you've done all of the other stuff right, bringing it to life with collateral can be so much fun. And here is just a process we like to recommend in these situations for when you create collateral, because like B2B messaging is sometimes not that great. Same thing with collateral. We have sometimes way too many pieces of collateral. We have collateral that gets rushed, or, you know, we do a lot of like ad hoc creation of collateral in response to sales requests. And we end up with a content library that's bloated, unideal, and doesn't serve our vertical objectives. And it is really important to get this right with vertical, because you do all the other stuff right, the collateral is not right, it still falls apart with the customer. So this is a place that you have to nail it. At every place is a place you pretty much have to nail it. And the first thing we recommend, and so this is a simple change to make to your writing processes, is never writing anything unless you can do a 1-sentence why statement for why this piece of content needs to exist. And I recommend putting it in the header of the document. And it shouldn't be, you know, so that they know who we are. Like, it has to be hyper specific. Like, an example of one I wrote recently was, this piece of content needs to exist to overcome concerns about our product and its relation to the Cloud Act. Like, something that really is specific that says that's why this piece of content exists. And the reason you do it is because a lot of content starts out pretty good in the first draft, and then someone reads and they say, oh, this point should be in there. And what about this point? And what about that? And shouldn't you have a section on this? And you're like, no, that wasn't the point of this. Like, we can't, not every piece of content has to tell every piece of the story. And the why state, what?
That never happened.
Never happens. Gosh, you guys are all just like, none of my pain points resonate with you. None of you have been there.
Just make me a brochure of it.
Right? And make sure everything's in it. And I need 1,000 of them for my trade show.
And then also get sales to actually use it.
Yeah, right. We needed all this stuff, and then you go to the high spot and,
We don't have anything to sell,
oh,
even though you have a huge library.
yes. Or can you just create this one thing for me to send to them? This one's different.
This client
Ad
really
hoc
needs their
requests.
own
Like,
piece.
names just subtitling and Demetrius, yeah, no.
Is this a presentation or a therapy session? We have been through some things.
Clearly, we all need a little bit of therapy.
I know, or just them to listen to us a little bit more. Yeah, so, but the why statement helps, because once you have that really crisp why statement and you get those edits, you go, I love that, we're gonna put that in other pieces, but it doesn't match to this why statement. This piece is only for this.
Do you map out your why though against all the other whys? Because everyone could have a good why
Yes.
in that moment in time.
Yes.
So
In the ideal world, when you define the campaign plan, you have a bill of materials and you know what all the why statements are, it's not always the ideal world. That's my favorite place to do it, is you know what all the points you're gonna have to land are, you know how many pieces of content. But in the unideal world where you just say like, hey, we need a white paper and we need a blog post and we need a brochure for this, you at least have a why aligned to it, and you're not trying to make everything. That's, if you take one thing away from this, I think that like simplest possible why is like life-changing. People have the right content. So then the who, we talked about this with the persona. And the tip I like to add here, because again, none of this is groundbreaking, like you all know how to do this, but just hard to do. The who, I like to imagine that I'm gonna have to send this thing that I'm editing or reviewing or writing to someone who I know. Like, personas are great, or abstract personas are great, but I sometimes like to think, okay, so I've met somebody who runs the, you know, who works at the Department of Defense. And I have to think that, or I've met somebody who does cybersecurity for a factory. And I'm not just writing for my product guy who I know what he wants us to say. I'm going to write for this person. And I have to imagine, because we as writers, we as marketers, everyone wants approval. We want things to be good. And it's really hard to have the customer centered when they're not the person who's going to give you edits or feedback or performance feedback at the end of the year. So I like to imagine that real person, not just a persona, but someone say like, pretend that the first person who's gonna review this draft is that persona. And what would they say? Have we really written something that adds value, or have we written an essay paper on everything we know about their world? Have we done that? And if you have that who in mind and you're really writing something that will add value to them, I think you'll feel a lot more confident in the content. It's easier to fight the political battles later because you can say, really, do you want to send that to them? It's like, if you can get them to think of the who too, it helps. So then the action, again, something you all know, but like really knowing what the next step is after they read that content that you're trying to activate helps you decide what goes in and what goes out. If the next step is just download the white paper that's also on this topic, you write a little bit differently than if it's request a sales meeting. So knowing what the next action is, knowing what you're trying to prompt so you can follow that. And then I say the simplest possible what. And why I say that is that challenge we have where we get pressured to put everything we know about everything into every piece. We end up creating content that just tells way too many. So the simplest possible what, and I realize this text is tiny, is basically saying, what is the smallest amount of information I can provide to get them to take that action? What's the least I need to say? Because we can't absorb 5 points. We can't absorb 3 points barely. So I need to know, what does someone need to believe or need to understand to take the action I'm trying to prompt? And it might just be one thing. And then I only write proof points that align to that simplest possible what. And if it's 3 things, then I know what I have to do, and I have to make my language even more sharp and concise. But thinking, what are the things they need to believe to take this action, and what do I have to say to get them to believe that in the simplest possible way? So then we can again fight the battle of saying, no, they don't need to know that yet. They don't need to know yet that we have these certifications or awards to take this next action. They only need to know this, and that's why that's all it says. And then, I always like to say like sell, which means like know what's going to resonate in terms of delivery and style with that audience. I know a lot of marketing teams are getting pressure to create certain types of content, more interactive content, more visual content, brand aligned content. And those things can really make a difference, sure, but you need to have it be audience aligned. What is going to have the impact visually, what's compelling, but don't do it because you need to create more interactive content or because you need to create more videos. Do it because it's the extension of serving all of these other objectives. Questions or experiences on the content creation process or how this works for you all?
I guess I'm sort of surprised that you have such a big collateral thing, because I guess from my experience, a lot of the B2B stuff is mostly sort of sales and really presentations.
Yeah. So, what we're finding with vertical launches in particular is that sales teams want a lot. And so we try to define a bill of materials, and that doesn't, like, the first callbacks or the presentations are usually a part of that, but they're usually not only it. Usually there's some sort of like marketing touch points at the top of the funnel around an industry, blog posts, ebooks, white papers, social media campaigns. Then maybe there's like, okay, we're going to an event, and that's not our sales deck, that's a conference presentation, and we need that. So the collateral when you're targeting an industry can be the demands to do that can be pretty high. For those of you who are actively working vertical strategies, have you had to create a lot of or customize a lot of collateral? Yeah, right?
We make everything, infographics, interactive infographics,
Oh, yes.
videos, presentations, executive briefs, guides, FAQs, white
Yeah.
papers.
And then you get done with one round
research
and
reports,
yes, right?
thought leadership, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I am an advocate for creating like, I'm not gonna say, it would be lovely to believe that all you need is like a landing page on your website, and you're gonna be in a sales deck and you're gonna be credible in that industry. But if you haven't historically had a focus on that vertical, there is some work put in to create the amount of assets that resonate, like the thought leadership in the market, bylines in their industry publications. Like, there is a need to surround an industry with relevant content and collateral to be able to work there. Maybe someday that won't be the case, but right now, I think as companies who have not targeted vertical go to vertical, the customers need credibility drivers. They need to be able to find that you have a lot of resources, you understand them, and sales needs a lot too. So sales we find, whereas in like horizontal areas, maybe they never use our ebooks and white papers and blog posts. In vertical areas where they're not comfortable, they need a lot. And this process also applies to things like battle cards, industry 101s, industry POVs, training decks, all of the things we create from a sales enablement perspective, which can be significant. We find in industry, sometimes sales, sometimes they want a lot of marketing support. Sometimes they think they are presentation designers and infographic designers and can do everything themselves. In industries, we find sales tends to be more cautious and tends to want more marketing support. Doesn't mean you have to use it. I mean, there's a lift there. But this process applies to sales-focused materials, to customer-focused materials, and it's not just top of the funnel. It should extend through the entire journey.
I ask, how would you balance the increased demand for very hyper-specific content with the answering of that why question? A good example is for Mindbridge, we do localization, but we're in a million industries. And so like, I only have a very small marketing team, 20 people to support the whole company.
Yeah.
Like, I need a white paper for subtitling in the banking and finance industry in the DACH region. How am I going to repurpose that in a way that's still effective for that?
Yeah. So the first thing we always say is it starts with the company having a sales focus, because marketing can't focus on 20 verticals or 50 verticals equally and really do this well. So it helps a lot for you to know, okay, light touch industries are these 35. Like that's where you have to just keep the lights on, do what's needed, but you can't dedicate all your resources. But these 3 industries, that's where we're gonna go big. And that should be based on the company having really set a clear strategy for industry. There should be budget allocated to that. Like if you're going after an industry, you may need to have a marketer who's really dedicated to that industry, building up the plan and the content. So hyper-specific content, if you're like, I have a client who knew that they wanted to grow in the public sector in Australia, France, and the US Department of Defense. And instead, our normal approach might have been to create like public sector content overarching, but the public sector, it's incredibly challenging to create content that works globally. The public sector is shockingly different in different countries. In some countries, healthcare is part of the public sector. In some countries, it's not. A lot of challenges with regulations for what you can and cannot do. So there, like, whereas with, I don't know, manufacturing, we might have been able to get away with global content, and our why could be prove X in this industry. In the public sector, we've had to get down to the level of being like, this is for the Australian government about the certification requirements for X. And we created much more specific content, both for customer facing, much more specific content for sales, but it was worth it because there was like the billions number was what was behind that revenue opportunity. So, whereas, if it's just, if you have to map that to the opportunity, and sometimes that requires a level of focus that a lot of companies don't have. But as marketers, I think you can at least point out the gap. If you don't have it, if a company
So in
knows,
that sense, your verticals were geographic almost.
yeah, it was a matrix of both vertical and geo. So we knew it was the public sector, but very different strategy for Singapore than it was for Australia, than it was for France, than it was for DoD. And in that case, in public sector, you're going to face that. In healthcare, you would likely face that. And a lot of marketing teams have global, regional industry layers that have to be orchestrated across, which isn't easy, but is a precursor to doing this well.
So you're getting on a point that is relevant for me because I work in international organizations, so supporting Latin America and Asia, several different countries, several different business models, sell different products, different target consumers. So you talk about strategy and focus. So you would say that almost the marketing strategy has to be aligned in each market, considering how they're different.
Yeah.
Before getting to this step.
Yeah, I would say all the way back in the go-to-market strategy, knowing how your company sets growth targets and then being able to align your marketing strategy to that is important. So some companies have, not even every company yet who prioritizes an industry even sets a revenue target for that industry. Sometimes you find that you're serving different regions and they all have small revenue targets for that industry and you're piecing it together. So there's not like a one size fits all answer to that, but however your company sets targets, growth targets, revenue targets is the place to start with this. And if there was no dollar sign by an industry anywhere in the list, I think that's a really good place to start pushing before you start executing, because it's really hard to know how to right size your efforts and your energy if it's just like somebody with a strong personality is excited about this industry compared to, no, the company has made a commitment, it's on our books that we're supporting this industry. And when your regional levels are different, that's a challenge too. So like I've definitely run campaigns that are like, we need to build pipeline in this industry, in this region, because that's what they've set, but that's a different why. Great question. Okay, the rollout. And this is where we talked about like everything else is riding on your ability to roll out. We could do an entire presentation on how just to roll out for sales. But one thing I would definitely make sure you take away is constant drumbeat of training. And even if sales enablement will only commit to training, getting them to commit to a constant drumbeat of training is really important. Because to get sales to have any sort of industry comfort level with a one-time training, even if it's accessible on demand in the Sales Success Center, will not be enough. There has to be a repetitive drumbeat of helping them understand the industry, how to sell into it. It cannot be sort of perfunctory approach to equipping sales. Creating a sales enablement kit and making it easy to use. We've written things like, okay, here's the ebook for this industry. Here's an email to send it of how you would phrase it to the industry. Here's the type of person you would send it to. Making it almost like foolproof is useful in this case. And then providing access to the experts who can support. And we talked about there's pros and cons to bringing in industry experts into those sales meetings because they can become a crutch. But while you're in the journey of committing to them, they can make a huge difference. And sometimes good salespeople who really believe in the strategy, but just aren't quite there yet, able to execute, can learn a lot from that experience because they'll see the difference in the questions they ask, the language they use, the anecdotes they share, and they'll learn from that. So done right, making those experts accessible to the sales meetings is really useful. And then external, meeting the prospects where they are, which again is marketing 101, but sometimes it's really hard to know, okay, what is credible in this industry? What publications and events and resources are credible to them? Where do these people show up? It's worth doing the time to do that, which means your industry launches usually can't be like repeatable and off the shelf. They have to be customized to the industry because where they go is different. Knowing who influences them, you can find the strangest influencers in B2B industries. There was a gentleman who literally had a newsletter, just a tiny, ugly newsletter about a niche topic. And we found it was one of the greatest sources of sales qualified leads for this particular client. And I mean, it was so affordable and so efficient because it's just this gentleman's newsletter. But it turns out everyone who was buying what they were selling needed that. So we often do like influencer strategy or market strategy, sort of like, well, we'll go look at these places and they're like, Forbes, Brand Voice, we'll do a little bit of that, we'll put it on our blog, we'll go to LinkedIn, and you miss the opportunities to find those niche influencers who will actually give you the credibility and are sometimes really affordable compared to the enterprise-wide, non-industry specific publications you may be used to working in. And then plan for an ongoing campaigns. I'm sure you all understand that like industry is not a quarterly priority. To be credible, it has to be extended. Okay, giving me the 5-minute warning, but I got through that last slide. Questions, other thoughts, anything you all are experiencing or that we haven't talked about?
I think you sort of took over your session already.
No, I loved it. You know, you never know. It's like, is this going to be relevant to anyone what I'm dealing with? So I was so glad to see this.
So there's a couple that I need to
that are relevant to industries that we have experience in. And, so there are some industries, let's say K through 12 education,
Yeah.
right? They have certain like special funding windows,
Mhm.
the government for technology.
Yeah,
services,
their own
right?
cycle.
So we don't actually help with those programs, but we get involved in those programs. So we do a lot of like side kind of content
Mhm.
that helps educate those, targets, those prospects about the programs.
Okay.
So that we can be like a
Yeah.
trusted partner more than actually, helping them through the
Yeah,
financial
Not
process of
facilitating it, but
because we're not allowed to
Mhm.
do that.
Yeah.
But we can help them understand what's available and when and what they have to do.
yeah, sure.
So it's just a different kind of a third
Yeah.
party kind of tactic.
But I think that's so smart because it's like very niche to them.
But when you see stuff like that, I mean, they're not the only ones, but that's an example. But when you see a certain industry that has that sort of thing going on, then you can set forth a timed marketing
Yeah.
program on either an annual basis or whatever it is, that when that triggers, right?
Absolutely.
You need to be prepared for. So it's depending on what industries you're working in.
Yeah,
Kind of important to take a look at.
it is like the burst of the timeline of when we talked about like campaigns, but when to time those campaigns and also how to get resources to those campaigns.
Yeah.
Because if somebody is like, they've got industry or education selling as like a training part of their job, them knowing in advance, you need to turn your attention here at this time helps a lot.
I'd like to maybe reach out